Okay. Alrighty, let's get started here. Okay, so obviously today we're going to keep going talking about kind of some of our preliminary things about doing social research. You know, kind of pick up from where we left off last time. We were talking about sort of our general epistemological approaches. We're going to move on to ontological kind of considerations today, and then get in a little bit more into the kind of qual-quant differences. Before I do that, though, I just want to check that everyone is doing okay and that you don't have any burning questions about the course, the assignments, or something you desperately need to ask. You can always come talk to me after class, but yeah, I just want to make sure that we're all sort of good. Just a reminder, there's no lab this week on Thursday. The first lab will be next week on Thursday. So, all right, going once, going twice. All right, let's jump in. Okay, I guess I'll just kind of sum up what we talked about last time, right? We were ending off, I still have all my doodles on there, which is, I usually throw them off. We had our three kind of epistemological positions, right? So how you get knowledge, positivism, by which you use, the scientific method, observation and typically quantification. Interpretivism, which is more qualitative, where you're more interested in understanding people's lives as they understand them. So instead of assuming there's like a definitive social world that we can measure, you're wanting to sort of give descriptions of people's lived realities, if you will. And then the critical approach, which will use both, kind of positivist, kind of quasi-scientific and interpretivist sort of methods, but mostly comes at it kind of at the question of knowledge, saying there's nothing value-free even about scientific knowledge, that science and its discourses are created by particular power structures and always has a sort of practical or praxis kind of thing to it, where it wants to not only describe the social world, but change it. Okay. So, ontological considerations. So what does that mean? So ontology, right, is basically our view of reality, right? So, an ontological consideration is what kind of positions are there about the nature of reality, or if, we're talking here about the nature of social reality, right? Is it basically objective and something that can be, actually known? Or is it constructed so there's really no reality out there with which to grasp? Okay, so let me just break this down into kind of, three positions. So the first one in terms of kind of ontological questions is the objectivist perspective, which basically says social phenomenon have an objective reality, right? There's something really there. Society is a real thing that we can measure, right? And it's independent of our perceptions. That there's a social reality that just exists out there, right? That basically whether, this would be answering the question, oh, excuse me, I'm going to have hiccups and I'm going to sneeze, and it's a wonderful day. Sorry, I'm trying to fight the sneeze. I don't know why, so maybe I should just let it happen. The objectivist perspective answers the question like, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? As, of course, that's a stupid question. Sound is independent of observation, right? So basically, there's an objective reality out there that can be measured, right? And so independent of our perceptions, there are social realities. So it happens whether we perceive it or not, and whether our lens or interpretation is this, that, or the other thing, there's a social reality that exists. Okay. Now, the constructionist perspective. And there's two basic categories. We can kind of split them into hard constructionist and soft, or more middle ground constructionist. And I'll say most people kind of, who take a constructionist perspective, more or less end up here, right? Because this one is really hard to sort of maintain in an intellectually sort of rigorous way. Okay, but a constructionist view of reality says there really is no hard and fast reality that can be measured. All there is interpretations, right? Everything is just our mental constructions. Our perception of reality is what sort of makes that of social reality is what makes that reality what it is, and therefore there's nothing objective to measure. Now, in the really hard constructionist sort of way of looking at this, right, there are no facts, there's only interpretations. Everything is just, how to put this? All of it might just be, from a really hard constructionist perspective, you're a brain in a jar being, stimulated by electrical impulses, and those electrical impulses are causing your jar brain to generate this reality. And we have no way of knowing whether there's an actual reality, because all you are is your brain, and your brain can only interpret what it's given as these kind of bioelectrical signals. So who knows if what we see is reality? There's really no way to know. And you can see how, well, it's an interesting intellectual exercise, right? And people have been doing it, since antiquity, but, very famously in the kind of postmodern era. This is a very postmodernist, Foucault and kind of Derrida kind of way of looking at things. It's not necessarily the most productive, because it's just like, okay, everything is just our interpretation, so does anything really actually matter? It ends up being a little bit nihilistic. So most people end up sort of, even if they might intellectually sort of agree with that, they end up acting more like this, right? So a constructionist or soft middle ground, I think sometimes also referred to as critical realism. Right, critical realism. So there's a whole school of sociology called critical realism that basically takes on this perspective, which says, okay, there is an objective reality, like the world is a real place. You're not a brain in a jar, in some lab on an alien spaceship. There is a real world, or floating in space inside an electrical storm, right? You're not just some disembodied brain. There's an objective reality out there, and an objective social reality. However, it's really hard to know it objectively, because it's always subject to someone's interpretation, right? Even if you quantify things and you measure things, inherently it has to be interpreted by you, and you have your biases. You speak a particular language, you're bound in a, socio-historical context. And so while there is that reality, you're never going to have a sort of perfect or purely scientific interpretation of that reality, because you are, at the end of the day, a human being, and you're interpreting things, and everybody else is also interpreting things. So you're really getting sort of people's riffs on that objective reality. No way to ever get it right down. Like, I guess, to put it, bluntly or not bluntly, I don't know. The only way that you could have a total kind of understanding of the world would be, a God's eye view. But because we're not God, and we can't have this like all-encompassing view of everything, we're limited down to our perspectives. This is impossible. So all we're getting is sort of our interpretations of whatever objective social reality exists. And again, I think this is where even most people would put themselves in that more constructionist camp end up, because, here it's really unproductive at the end of the day. Okay, sorry, does that make sense? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay. So, particularly our objectivist and our, let's say, our softer or more critical realist kind of constructivist orientation will change, a whole bunch of things, particularly, the kind of research questions you formulate and the way that research ends up being carried out, right? Because they come with their own assumptions as to what is the best way to gain knowledge. Like if the world is a particular way, what's the best way to get the best knowledge about the world? So, your objectivist is going to be more interested in straight up measuring, right? Because there's an objective reality that you can just measure and get down to as close to an accurate picture of the world as possible. You're more likely to end up in, say, positivism with that kind of structure. Someone who's more of a constructionist is going to be way more interested in talking to people and getting their perspectives, and then trying to kind of piece together how people understand their own lives, how they've constructed their own reality, social realities, and what that means, what that tells us, and potentially, what we can do about it if you're on the sort of activist or praxis sort of measure. Okay. This is the worst pun I could find, and I love it more than anything. Okay. Don't we all love qualitative research? All right, so I'm kind of hinting at it. Not hinting at it, just kind of using these terms throughout. But basically, in social research, we can break it down into two basic categories. And we're going to, now, I will say, I think I have this on another slide. The lines between these two are a lot blurrier than I'm going to make it seem, especially at the beginning of this course. That these are like these hard, fast categories that nobody kind of crosses. The truth is that I think the best social research, certainly the stuff that I like, is going to be a mix of these two. And I think the best kind of researchers, the ones I like, I guess, no, I'm kidding, are the ones who understand the strengths and weaknesses of both and can combine them in really interesting ways. Now that said, there are really strong kind of disagreements, within sociology as to which of these two is better, which should be given prime of place, and all of that kind of stuff. And you'll hear, if you hang around long enough and end up, working in this or any other sociology department, at some point you're going to hear the gripes, oh, we have too many qualitative researchers in this department, and we're not quant friendly enough. Or the opposite, we're too quant, especially if you're in the US, we're too quant heavy, we don't do enough qualitative research. Because inherently these two camps kind of go at it. Now that said, they both do a couple of things really, really well. So quantitative research, and that's where we're going to start the course out. So we're going to go through and look at a bunch of different things about quantitative research. But quantitative research is basically, it's probably the most common. Like it's the one that people do the most, and it's certainly the one that in a lot of ways is, I don't want to say the easiest, but it's definitely the easiest. In some senses, right? Because the tools that we use tend to require a lot less, say, time in the field to gain information. And quantitative research is all about numbers, right? It's all about numbers and statistics and collecting and analyzing data about society. So, number one tool for quantitative research, survey says, it's surveys. Which is why I say it's pretty on the easier side, right? When we think of what, in terms of like hours spent in the field trying to gain information, and I've done both of these, right? And I've done both of these on single projects. Surveys are way easier to field and get information. And I mean, just as an example, I did a mixed method project back in 2019. So I had 2 surveys and 6 focus groups, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, 6 focus groups, which involved, sitting around with people. And the surveys were so much faster, right? Basically, I found a survey company to put them out. I wrote it up, and I got my awesome survey writing friends to come up with, or help me come up with the survey questions and make sure I wasn't doing anything stupid. And then I fielded them, and when I put out the first survey, so I was surveying 500 people. So 500 people in Edmonton, I got those results in 2 days, right? I put out another one, which was 400 people, and I got those results in a day and a half, right? So in a day and a half, the survey company had already emailed me back the .save file so I could work with it in SPSS, and it was super fun. Okay, so there's an ease to quantitative research. Qualitative, and quantitative is all about measurement. Qualitative, generally speaking, when we talk about it, we're going to talk about rich accounts. So what does this mean? So generally speaking, it's gathering a whole bunch of people's perspectives, right, through interviews. Interviews are the most typical tool, but you can do interviews or ethnography. Sorry, I wrote rich and I didn't write accounts. Rich accounts. So either by, ethnography, actually going and sort of experiencing things with people, or by interviews, both are really common in qualitative research. And then taking that all together and expressing it, as, non-numeric symbols in the collection and analysis of data, you're writing it out, right? And you're generally kind of telling stories. You're telling the stories of the people you talk to, describing things in really rich detail so that anybody else kind of reading it and going through your research can understand all the rich context that went into what you wrote, right? So that is, our basic categories. And we're going to be living with these through the rest of the course. We're going to be kind of sitting back and forth. We're starting with up till mid or late October. We're doing quantitative research, and then we're going to flip into qualitative research. And so you should have a pretty good grasp of both by the end of the course. Okay, now, like I said, we tend to think these categories or we treat these, especially in intro SOS and intro to methods, as these really kind of strictly delineated categories. The truth is, like I said, I don't think they're as irreconcilable. And my favorite studies, and yes, I'm a sociology nerd, so I have favorite studies. My favorite of all is the National Study of Youth and Religion. Anyone who knows me will know why. Went from 2002 all the way until like last year when they published their last book. So a really long study and really amazing results. But we could talk about that possibly in a completely different class. In SOS of Religion or some other class that I teach. Okay, so yeah, I don't know that they're quite this distinct. Kabang. But we'll treat them as such for now. And like I said, most studies that I really like will have a quantitative element, like you start with surveys, and then the surveys inform what you do then in interviews. So like the National Study of Youth and Religion started in its first wave anyway with 3,000 people answering surveys, and then about 300, I don't know why at the bottom of my screen it's harder to write without gaps, but about 300 interviews. And all that got put together into like 25 different books and hundreds of articles. They kind of inform each other, and if you read someone who knows what they're doing using these two components together, it ends up creating a really rich account where you have like a bunch of statistical evidence, then informed a bunch of interview questions that were really rich as well. So I think the best studies are, okay, I have friends who would beat me up for saying it this way, mixed method. You can also call them multiple method. And my friend Dorothy, we've had like arguments about whether mixed method or a multiple method is the correct terminology. Some of them got pretty heated because she's of the opinion that we should use multi-method because mixed methods don't really exist. But, multi-method, more than one method to describe the same phenomenon. Okay, so that said, I'm going to erase the doodle I have up here and just kind of go over this really quickly. So, when we talk about our quantitative, qualitative, and the categories we've been talking about so far in the class, right? In quantitative, we're mainly talking about, and again, mainly is doing a lot of work here, mainly talking about deductive, right? So mostly from theory to data. Data? I can never remember which is the correct English pronunciation of that word. Theory to data. We'll go with data. Theory to data, right? And you're testing that theory, typically. It's typically a natural science model, right? Where you're trying to prove or disprove hypotheses. And if you read papers that are written in sociology that are quantitative, right, you'll often see it's like, okay, we had 3 hypotheses that we were testing based on this data. So hypothesis H1 was, this. And we tested it against the data and found no support for the hypothesis. Hypothesis 2, right? And this is how they kind of do it. They're testing different hypotheses with, against the data. And it tends to be objectivist, right? That there's a sense that there's a real social world out there that you're just measuring with your research tools. Okay, qualitative, so again, in research, tends to be inductive, right? Often qualitative studies, you start with data collection, and then as you go through, and often in these multiple iterative steps, you develop your theory of what's going on, right? So again, grounded theory is the thing that we do. It's much more interested in like people's interpretations of their lives rather than an assumption of a sort of static social reality that you can just measure. It's like, okay, how do people make sense of their own lives? And it assumes a sort of construction of reality. And like I said, typically a softer one, like there is a social reality, but how do people move and live and understand that social reality through their own experiences? Okay, is that all clear? Okay, yes? I don't want to make eye contact with any one person for too long and make you feel uncomfortable, so I dart my head around. There we go. Okay. So what influences the conduct of social research? So obviously, we've talked about, theory a little bit. You might have grand theories, especially, if you come at stuff from, say, functionalist kind of way of viewing things, you're going to approach research in a particular way. If you are, from a conflict theory or more Marxist kind of tradition, you're going to do research in a different way. Epistemology, right? What's a valid way of getting data? And your ontology, what is the nature of the social reality you're trying to study? We've talked about those already. But there's a few others that are worth kind of thinking about. So I've got slides on, okay, I don't know if I have slides on practical considerations, which is where I forget, but values, we'll talk about that in a sec. Politics, so someone's politics, and even the politics around money can play a big role. And then practical considerations, and this one's always a fun one to think about, especially as, if you're conceiving a research project, in this class we can dream big. You can dream of the greatest research project ever done by humankind. What would you do? In reality, though, there are some things that are never going to work. Unless you're my boss, because she's amazing. She can, I don't know. So I'll tell you a funny thing about my boss, Sandra Bucerius, who runs the Center for Criminological Research. So they're doing prison research now, and honestly, they're in prisons interviewing people on the day of release. And this is the second time they've been let into prisons in Alberta to talk to people who are incarcerated about their experiences. And it's a really cool project. You'll hear more about it as I go through. But there's one researcher in Ottawa. His name is Justin Pichet. He's a fun guy. He says a lot. I had to edit one of his podcasts one time, and I swear I edited out the word 782,000 times. It's like every other, it's like and sometimes he holds it really long. I got to see, I could see it on the wavelengths for the sound. I was like, oh, there's an I didn't even have to listen to it after a while. Anyway, I discovered I don't ever want to edit a podcast ever again. Anyway, Justin's funny because when he talks about Sandra, he's like, she's a liar. Because there's no way you could ever get into prisons to do interviews. They would never let you. Now, it so happens that Pichet, for all his merits as a researcher, is also an anti-prison decarceration scholar. So you can imagine someone who's like, we should abolish all prisons, being like, hey, I'd like to come into your prison and do research, and about how well that would go. But he frequently accuses Sandra of lying about her research, because he's like, you can't do in-prison research. It's impossible. But she does. Outside of Sandra, who I swear can get in anywhere. I don't know how she does it. I think she made some kind of pact with a dark spirit. Sold her soul. She's like, I would like to do prison research. And someone shows up and is like, would you like to come into our prison? And honestly, it drops into her lap. It's the funniest thing. But she knows how to manage the politics. But for most people, practical considerations are going to be a big deal, right? Not every space is going to want you in there doing research, right? And some spaces, there's politics that might, you might think you have a great research project, right? You want to say Indigenous people in prison, what are their spiritual lives like, and how do they react to having Indigenous spiritual practices, introduced into a prison setting. You might think that's a super interesting idea, and it is. However, what might happen is the prison doesn't offer those kinds of programs, and they don't really want that to become public knowledge. So they're like, no, go away, right? And there's all sorts of spaces that we can't access. I've had, over my years of teaching this class, people be like, I'm going to ask Twitter for their data on their users. And I'm like, no, that would never work, because or Instagram, that's how they make their money, is all of that user data. And they are never, ever going to give it to you. So there's a lot of things that in magical land where we get all access and everybody is as interested in just research for the purity of knowing things about the world. There's if that world existed, we could do some really cool research, but people are small and petty, and they protect their little fiefdoms, and that's hard. There's also other things like, what is one of the practical considerations? Money. Research costs a lot of money, and there's limited ways in which you can get that money. And I don't have a symbol for this one. Time, right? How long is it going to take you to do your research project? If the answer is this is a multi-generational study, stop it. Don't do that. Well, you might want to, and have children who are going to carry on your legacy, or grad students who are kind of like children in some ways. I laugh. I was a grad student once too. But time, time, money, these are all practical considerations that you probably want to take into account, and things like access. Okay, let's talk values. Okay, so values, right? Everybody has values. Everybody comes into any sort of research project with certain values. Now, you may not necessarily be aware of your values. That's where reflexivity, which we'll talk about in a sec, comes in really handy. But no one is value free, right? As a researcher, you might want to do the most rigorous, value free kind of research possible, but you yourself, have certain values. Maybe you are a feminist, right? Maybe you are, of a certain religious group. Maybe, whatever it happens to be, everybody has values, and those values inherently will influence things like the choice of topic, right? What are you, and even like on the same phenomenon, right? Two people with different values might want to look at the same phenomenon and come up with, very different ways of approaching it, right? So it might have influenced the choice of topic, but most likely I think it's likely to affect things like formulation of research question, right? Someone who comes from, say, a critical tradition whose values really center around anti-oppressive practices is going to, probably ask a really different question, say, about prisons, than someone who's a little bit more from, say, an objectivist kind of perspective, or who values just straight up description, or, say you're socially conservative, right? You might ask different questions about prison research, right? Because you come from different kind of value sets. Right? You're not going to ask, let's say a conservative is not likely to ask questions about, how you can reduce oppressive practices in prison for the benefit of rehabilitation, right? Whereas, say, someone who's from a more critical position is not likely to ask questions about how you can enhance public safety for middle class people, right? They're going to come at questions from different perspectives, right? So, choice of method, that could be influenced by values as well, right? How do you want to learn about things, right? Are you going to choose maybe interviews or surveys versus an ethnography, right, where you participate in things based on the kind of values that you have? How do you put together your research design and data collection, how you actually collect the data. And I think probably values play the biggest role in analysis of data, interpretation, and conclusions, right? So when you write it up, And when you put it together, and you tell the story of your research, which is always, I think the hardest but most important part is you write it, you read journal articles, you write books, and all of these sorts of things. How are you presenting that data? How are you interpreting that data will come largely from your values and what you believe about the world and all these sorts of things, right? And you can kind of understand that, right? Someone who's from, say, a more critical Marxist kind of perspective will obviously see things through that lens and write an account, probably that has some kind of praxis involved. Whereas someone who's maybe a little bit more, I don't know, from a structural functionalist perspective, which is really worried about how institutions work for society and how we can ensure the smooth operation of society, one would be like revolutionary and say, we need to tear down these institutions to give people more freedom. And the other is like, no, we need to strengthen those institutions to give more social stability. And that's usually where values kind of affect, things in major ways, is at these kinds of three levels. Okay, and reflexivity here is important. And what reflexivity really is just a reflection for you as a research on where your values and decisions might impact the research, right? And, I think a good researcher and one who's being really honest is someone who sort of, I was going to say, lets their flag fly, but maybe that's not the right way of putting it, is honest about what perspectives they have, right? And how that maybe influence the research they did or the conclusions that they come to, right? Okay, I mean, just as an example, right? So my PhD project, I did some work on Russian television. Actually, I did a lot of work on Russian television, where basically I described the Russian TV industry. And as part of like my kind of introduction, I sort of lay bare, this is who I am as a researcher, right? I am, a Canadian, right? I come to, I speak Russian, but I learned Russian as an adult. I'm from the West. And so anytime that I'm studying Russian TV, I'm doing it from that kind of Western perspective with those sorts of, Canadian Western democratic values. And so I see things in, a particular way. I don't know what I'm drawing here. I'm just going to doodle a little. I don't know what I was intending to draw. I had an idea and then it went away. I come at it from that perspective, but always admitting that, for people who grew up there, who are native Russians, right, who are from that culture, they often see things in very different ways than the way that I'm interpreting things because they come at it from a different perspective. This is my personal bias, right? I come from this kind of society, I value these sorts of things, and then people can sort of make the judgment, how did that affect, how did that affect my research? How did that maybe change my perspective, right? And I've seen people, for example, I can't remember their name, but they were, a person who had done a study of homophobia in Catholic schools, and they didn't disclose in their book that they themselves were part of the LGBTQ community and had been to a Catholic school and had felt it was rather oppressive at the time. And, as this comes out and you kind of figure out who this person is, it affects your view of them. Were they very objective or was it an agenda-driven kind of study, right? So putting out your value or who you are, what your values are, and where you're coming from can be really, really important in how people, understand your research. And it's an important step in saying, look, I do come at this from a certain perspective, and this is what it is. Okay, so that's still all making sense? Yeah. Oh, my question.
Also, could you say it's like confirmation bias on like the research and stuff?
Well, I think that at least admitting where you come from and sort of being open about it tells people where that confirmation bias might be, right? And so they can judge your research better if they know kind of where you're coming from. Does that make sense? Like if you're kind of trying to hide your, like, let's put it in really crude ways. This happens a lot in medical research. People will hide that they have a $1 million investment in Pfizer while they're doing their research on some drug that Pfizer put out, right? That's going to, and if you find that out, it's going to change how you interpret what that person had to say. If we're really honest about it and honest about things like, we'll talk about funding in a sec, but funding, your own perspectives, what motivates you, at least people understand that, and then they can, the reader, it can make a fair judgment about the validity of your research, right? And whether you've done a fair job of interpreting it. If you kind of try and hide your biases, right, that becomes a lot harder. Then people are sort of guessing. And you might not yourself be aware of how your values are affecting what you're writing up. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? I should draw something random on this slide too. I don't know what. Okay. So there's 3 different positions kind of generally on values in social research. This one I think you'll find most in sort of that quantitative and positivist tradition, that research should be value-free. That basically, your values shouldn't impact what you're researching or how you interpret the data. Now, I think that's probably really hard to do, in the sense that people care about different things, and even just that is going to skew the kind of questions you ask. But it's definitely a position, right? And this, I think, comes really from a kind of hard scientific position, right? From the idea of the social sciences being science. Science should be value-free, right? And science should be open to having its theories and hypotheses overturned by new theories and new hypotheses. And that's the way we should do research in social science as well. Like I said, I'm not a huge believer in the idea that it can be so value-free, but I understand the impulse. It's like we want to be as unbiased as possible because it makes our research more credible. Okay, I think this is where a lot of people end up. Certainly, this is kind of where if I were to situate myself, I'm right here. Research can't be value-free, but researchers should be explicit about their open and explicit about their values, right? Tell people who you are, what you're doing, and what that means, and that is going to give you generally good results. And then, I was going to draw a hammer and sickle here, but I'll just spare you my doodles. Sorry, my little Marxist joke for you. The third one, that researchers should use their values to direct and interpret their investigations, and that value commitment is a good thing for researchers to have, right? You see, again, a lot of this with what you might derisively call activist research. I wouldn't want to say that or those more kind of value-laden conflict theory or critical theory kind of ways of doing research, right? That your values should inform your research. It's a good thing for you to have, and especially if you're wanting to pursue some kind of social change, it's good to have those kinds of anchoring values that would lead you in particular directions towards especially positive social change. Okay. Politics in social research. Researchers sometimes take sides based on their politics, right? And I don't think it's any secret that a lot of sociologists are politically left of center, and so a lot of research in sociology is kind of progressive, left of center. It works its way into a lot of things, right? And some people will be really explicit about this, right? Like I was talking about my buddy Justin, the guy who says too much, right? He's a decarceration scholar, super socially progressive, and all of his research is aimed in that direction, right? His goal in life is to get rid of prisons, and he makes no bones about it because politically he thinks that would be the best thing for society. And again, we see lots of these sorts of kind of researchers. We see lots of researchers taking sides, right? In sociology, it's more left of center. In poli-sci, or in business, it's all right of center. So you get different kinds of sides. All right, now funding. In sociology, this tends to be less of a problem because most of the funding in Canada for big research projects comes either provincially or federally, but most of it, especially the big grants, comes from a body called SHRC, or the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, right? And that's the holy grail of research funding, because it's the one big body that we have in Canada that hands out really, really big research grants. There's some others, like Alberta has the Killam grant, But SHRC is the big one. So it's government funded. Now, typically the government does try to be fairly value neutral on who it grants, SHRC funding to, and the same with NSERC and there's SHRC, NSERC. SHRC is for social sciences, humanities. There's a third one. Oh, it's medical. I can't remember what it's called, and that's going to haunt me. But it doesn't matter. NSERC is for science and engineering. SHRC is for social sciences and humanities. They try to be fairly value neutral, but in some periods, right, like particularly under the government of Stephen Harper, there were some initiatives under the Harper government to push research in a particular kind of business-friendly, what you might call neoliberal sort of direction, which a lot of people felt was, not appropriate. But people will often, then write research grants in order to appeal to a particular government and its mandates for research funding. And so one of the things, if you track these things, and don't we all, please don't start looking through the different SHRC research projects that get funded. You have better things to do with your lives, I think, than track what kind of funding research gets. But they do tend to be kind of trendy, right? For a certain period of time, one type of project will get funded. For a few years, it was a lot of stuff on globalization, right? Because there was a big kind of everybody was talking about globalization, and so if you looked at the applicants, everything had globalization in it because it appealed to, the government's particular thing, we want Canada to be more globalized. So we want more research projects on globalization. After the George Floyd murder, a lot of things came to be about race. After the discoveries in Kamloops of unmarked graves, right? A lot of things in Canada have been about questions around indigeneity and Indigenous people. And it's just, there can be really strong trends where government's we want to put money into this and focus on this. And sometimes people will play to those particular things, right? Because there is always funding. Now, if you get private sector funding, and this is unlikely in the social sciences, because mostly, how to put it, the private sector doesn't care about social research that much. Marketing, yes. Social research, no. But say in a lot of, science and medical fields, particular companies will provide funding, and sometimes that funding comes with strings attached, right? And there's been lots of stories of how different companies have sort of secretly told researchers, it would be really great if this is what you found in your research, especially with big pharma. Pharma's been accused of this a lot. So funding can play a big role, in the kind of findings sometimes people report. You might be playing for certain things. And sometimes, even with SHRC funding, I've certainly heard stories where people will, at least in the initial stages, I don't know how honest I should be about how dishonest researchers can be, make you all hate us. I'll put it this way. So one person that I know, I won't say who it is, worked on a big project. It was funded by SHRC. They both had access to the data. They'd done it together. And the other person on the project wrote this whole research paper, with these crazy findings. And my friend was like, after they saw it published, they were like, what the hell is this? Because none of that data was actually in the study they found. The person made up their results and went back to their friend and were like, what is this? And they're like, oh, I was writing another research proposal hoping to get more money to study this subject, and this is what is trendy right now, so I made up the results, got them published, and all that stuff, right? So sometimes in search of funding, right? I know we're all communists as sociology professors, but we still love money. It's weird. Every year on July 1st, when the new salaries get posted, apparently, and I didn't know this, all the professors go on and look on the sunshine list at what all of the other professors in sociology are getting paid. So we don't care about money because screw capitalism, but also how much am I getting paid? Those things. Sometimes people write, particular papers, create results so they can get more funding, because it's like, if I find a provocative result here, well, then I can get more funding later on and keep the gravy train rolling, right? Because these grants are a lot of money. And one thing that sucks in academic research is having no money to do research. Trust me, right now, my boss has like a $2.5 million research grant, and the money flows like water, and it's kind of amazing. So much better than being like, can we get $15 to buy a tin of coffee? No, denied. Okay, how am I doing for time? Bad, as always. No, it's fine. We got all semester. We're not in any hurry. I always have extra space. It's all good. Okay, so, all right. I'll do this really. I'll talk about this really quickly. Research subjects and participants, right? All right. So when it comes to doing research, there can be politics, right, in terms of things like gatekeepers, right? You want to do research or you want to get funding. Are there strings attached, right? How can you get access? And this, I know Sandra's dealt with this accusation from people like Justin. Pichet is like, okay, to do prison research, what did you have to give them in order to get into the prison? Like, are there strings attached? Are there certain things that you absolutely need to say? Do you need to be pro-prison in your in the way that you present findings? What? Oh, another one. Sandra's amazing. Like I said, she does all sorts of weird studies. They did one of student resource officers in schools, right? Police officers in schools. And basically interviewed parents, her and two collaborators, on the student resource officers in Edmonton public schools, and found that people were generally supportive, and got accused by other researchers of basically being in the pocket of the police, right? That EPS had given them access, to talk to officers and all of these things, only because, they knew that they would come up with a favorable result for the police, right? And so, there's always this question, are there strings attached to access? And one of the things is getting into spaces is really, really hard, right? People don't always want to let you in, and so there's always a question of, are there strings attached in getting into particular spaces? All right, and yeah, I guess I'll say one sentence about this. We'll pick up from here next time. What sorts of findings are acceptable to those who fund or publish research, right? Research journals and publishers. Are there certain things that they wouldn't fund, and do people then write to those results? All right, we'll leave it there, 1 minute early. And we will see you on Wednesday, and we'll keep going. We'll talk about, more stuff. What a good research question is. That'll be fun.